We have other examples of expulsions in history prior to this. But what was unprecedented about this? Was it the scope, or the just sort of the mechanism, or the planning? And because obviously it's expulsion when somebody starts to pry the siding off your house, but it's the sort of like it's a state machinery that is doing this at this point.
Right. So these sorts of state-sponsored deportations or mass deportations, they do go back thousands of years. What's unprecedented about this one is just how systematic it is, just how bureaucratic it is. Because the United States dreams up this policy that they're going to move every single person, and then it's not that they're run off. It's not that an army marches in and everybody flees. It's that they send out census takers and Indian agents, as they were called, to record everybody's name and to describe their property in detail, down to the number of windows in each cabin. So there's this state bureaucracy. Now, from our perspective today, it's minuscule. But back in the early 19th century, this was something new, that they were going to turn this into a kind of bureaucratic process. And because it was so bureaucratic, the state administrators thought that it was just, that somehow this was going to become a model for other nations around the world about how to treat populations justly.
Was that the point? I mean, because as you know, you're describing we're going to take census and we're going to write their names down and we're going to put their, how many windows. Was it simply basically to make it seem like it was a more civilized act?
I think
what would they do with that information at that point? Like, okay, now we have it on the sheet, and now we're going to put you on the Trail of Tears, and you may or may not make it. But if you do, we'll know that you were here. I mean, what's the value of that?
Yeah, I mean, in many cases, the value was to not waste money. The person who oversaw the operation was the Commissary General of Subsistence. He's really a kind of glorified accountant in the War Department, as it was then called. And he monitored federal expenses that went towards feeding, in normal times, soldiers in the U.S. Army. Now he was suddenly tasked with monitoring federal expenses directed at deporting people. So every single penny, in fact, down to the fraction of a penny, literally had to be accounted for. And so all of these records are now in the National Archives. And if you go to the records in the Treasury Department of the Second Auditor's Office, there are just thousands and thousands of pages of receipts documenting how much money had been spent on this operation. But over and over again, the Commissary General, George Gibson, says, don't spend more than you need to. This or that is a wasted expense. I can't reimburse you for that. We need not to waste the public's money. So there's that part of it. At other times, some of the records are produced as a result of specific stipulations in some of the treaties that they had signed with Indian peoples. So Americans in the 1830s, they're living in this republic, and they're very conscious that it's a republic, and they are very conscious that their republic is going to be and is going to be different from the corrupt, tyrannical empires in Europe. And so I think that's also part of it, that here, this is how we do it in a republic. We send out administrators, and this will unfold according to the way that a civilized Republican government conducts such operations.
Well, two things that strike me. One is that it would make reparations much easier, at least in terms of, like, we have the records, it wouldn't be that hard to sort of update the value of that land and any type of other compensation beyond that. A and B, they ended up though spending. I don't even know the multiples of how many times, like 75 times more than they had initially allotted, right? I mean, it was almost like $1 trillion in today's dollars.
Right. Well, to get the act through Congress, I mean, it works the same way today. They underestimate the cost, and it was the actual piece of legislation appropriated $500,000 to move 80 to 100,000 people. I mean, it was absurdly small, and I think almost everybody understood that at the time. And then, of course, none of it unfolded according to the promises that Southern politicians had made to the public. And eventually, the United States has to fight a couple of wars to move people because, of course, they're not going to cooperate with their own deportation. So they have to send troops into the Creek Nation in 1836. And then even more costly is they have to fight a war against the Seminoles, which rages from 1835 to 1842. It's extraordinarily costly in both lives and dollars, and it's mostly fought for naught because it's not even land at the time. Florida is not considered to be particularly valuable land. It's swamps and marshes. But here they are pursuing these refugee families down to the tip of the Florida Peninsula to try to round them up and deport them to Indian territory. And a lot of Americans recognize at the time that this is just it's an unjust war and it's a fiasco, but they continue to fight it nonetheless.
Explain to me, there was an 1832 Supreme Court ruling. What were the implications of that ruling? Just tell us what the ruling was and what the implications of it were, and about the timing. Seems of that as opposed to it happening before 1830. Talk about that.
So I mentioned that the southern states had extended their laws over Indian nations, which were sovereign entities, sovereign nations, just like the United States. So the Cherokee Nation sued, and there was one case in 1831 in which it was determined that the Cherokee Nation didn't have standing, and then there was a second case, the one you referred to, Worcester v. Georgia, in 1832, that hinged on this very question: did the state of Georgia have the right to extend its laws over the Cherokee Nation? The ruling, in fact, came down as a victory for the Cherokees, and there were celebrations the day that it was in the Cherokee Nation, the day that it was handed down. It was this tremendous victory when the Supreme Court said that no, this was not permissible. Andrew Jackson, however, did not enforce this ruling. At the end of the day, it didn't matter. Georgia ignored the ruling. It still sent its troops and federal, or rather state militia, into the Cherokee Nation. And it just pretended as if the ruling had never existed.
Talk about the financiers in the North who, and we've had many historians who have come on and talk about the relationship between northern industry and finance and cotton, and that symbiotic relationship. There was a similar one with this removal as well.
Yeah, it was one of the things that really surprised me when I started digging into this story, because we think of it largely as a Southern story, and we think about it largely as a kind of political story. But in fact, to my surprise, Wall Street was deeply involved because these financiers recognized immediately that this was a rare opportunity to make tremendous profits, right? Some of the most valuable agricultural lands in the entire world were suddenly, millions of acres of land were suddenly becoming available, were being thrown onto the market. And so these financiers, all of the leading financiers in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, formed these joint stock companies, pulled their capital, and flooded the South with money, buying this land from indigenous Americans. And that's a whole other ugly story we can go into, but really kind of cheating Native peoples out of their lands, and then turning around and reselling that land to planters and making profits of 300, 400, 500, sometimes even 1,000%. So you can read through their correspondence, and they're kind of marveling at just the opportunity that is once in a lifetime or once in a millennium, they were saying to each other, to make just a tremendous amount of money. What was even more surprising to me is that there are these connections to Wall Street, but investors in Europe get involved as well and put their money into dispossessing Native peoples.
How much were they? I mean, I got to imagine that some of these financiers were aware that, like, you know, in the 1920s, that this could be a boon, and that they did you find evidence that they were also lobbying their northern counterparts in terms of Congress? Because this, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I guess, like, I mean, the entire story, it seems to me, of the dispossession of indigenous people was always about money and resources, it seems to me. I mean, I'm sure there were political elements, you know, that were, but it was always the primary force for all of this has been essentially capitalism.
Absolutely. But it is these Southern politicians who are making the push. And I think that's why we had for so long thought of this as a Southern story. But as you say, I mean, it's only in the last generation that we really have historians have started to recognize just how deeply embedded these connections were between Northern finance and Southern slavery. And so this is just kind of a further extension of that, they're also investing deeply in the dispossession of Native peoples.
And it also ends up on a political level, it provides that support, right? I mean, if everybody, if you're getting different elements from across the country who are invested in this, literally, then you're also part of their buy-in is their political power.
Yeah, and so the lobbying that I found was less on the political legislative side, although I do wonder if there's not more to be learned about that, and more on the kind of back end lobbying with the Treasury Department, so Wall Street banks trying to fight to have the right to issue bonds or buy bonds on behalf of X, Y, and Z, or have the right to purchase Indian lands, trying to get the federal government to sign off on the purchases. So these kinds of back end inside dealing in order to turn a profit at the expense of Native Americans.